Welcome everyone. My name is Michelle Roos. I'm the Executive Director of the Environmental Protection Network. I believe I've at least spoken or emailed to all of you, but I have not necessarily seen your faces. So it's wonderful to see all of you, and thank you so much for joining today. And happy Juneteenth to all. I was telling Mustafa this morning that I had the privilege and the opportunity to tell my children about Juneteenth today, and they were both shocked and appalled that there were folks that were free and did not know they were free for such a long period of time. And it was definitely a continuation of a much larger conversation that's going on in our household, as well as I'm sure in many of yours during this very challenging time. We have almost 60 folks on the line at this time, which is a real testament to the importance of these issues, and also our highly committed expert network. And I did, before we get started, want to thank all of you, many of whom are members, donors, prospective donors, and foundation funders. We now have 500 EPA alum that serve as our expert network all across the country. Not even half of those folks are in the DC area. And you all have submitted over 60 formal comments and have spoken to reporters almost 1,000 times in just a few years. We, as staff, want to thank you as volunteers. We are in awe of the work that you did throughout your 20, 30, even 40-year careers at EPA, and your willingness to volunteer your time during this moment. I also want to thank my colleagues, fellow staff and contractors at EPN who make this all happen behind the scenes. A quick note on this moment in time I referenced earlier before I hand things over to Rob Walcott, who I mentioned is one of our founders and the chair of our board of directors, will introduce our speakers. In thinking about the title for this webinar, we wanted to emphasize both the incredible sadness of this time in our country's history, but also the incredible opportunity. We're experiencing and seeing in real time on the news and social media and on the street a trifecta of intersecting and overlapping devastating events, an international pandemic, systemic racism, and a cruel and incompetent administration. I'm personally thankful to work for EPN as we continue to try to do our part of this important work. And I'm hopeful that we will use today to continue to learn, to challenge ourselves, and to recommit to repairing the world. I wanted to thank Rob personally for giving me this opportunity to help lead EPN and to hand things over to him.
You're very kind. Thank you for your leadership. And thanks to all that team that you have with you, that we all have. I'd like to just briefly mention their names because they are the ones who make this possible in so many ways. Sebastian Irby is Michelle's right hand. Jake Seal is the one who keeps our issue teams flowing. Michelle Montoya is the one who keeps us on the right train at the right time. Kathy Pope is the one who keeps the tank full of financial resources to keep us going. And Jeremy Simons is the one who is most recent, but is leading the reset effort and doing so in a marvelous way, for which we're greatly appreciative. You mentioned our funders, and I again thank all of you.
Karen Kagan.
And oh, I'm sorry. And June reminds me of things that I can't see, but also fail to remember. Karen Kagan Evans is our dynamite media person who makes sure there's a platform by which our membership can really be given voice and be allowed that kind of passage to all of those folks on the other end of media world. I want to thank our funders, a number of whom are on the call. You're so generous, and it's allowed us to really, step up and flourish in a time that desperately, speaks out for what must be said on the matters that must be addressed. I want to thank the board of directors of EPN. There are 10 of us total. I want to thank Ruth Greenspan Bell, in whose living room this good ship EPN was launched 3+ years ago. I want to thank Carolyn Isber and Sally Erickson. I want to thank Barbara Elkis. I want to thank Gwen Keyes Fleming, Stan Myberg, Mark Haig, and Bharat Mather, all of whom just brought great energy, wisdom, and insight for our organization.
George.
And I also want to thank George Wyeth, who's just been a key founder and leader, on the board. I also want to thank our advisory council that's been so very engaged and valuable, and is co-led by Bob Perciasepi and Linda Fisher, both real leaders in EPA in different eras, but they brought just a great deal of wisdom and energy to our effort. What we're about today is a program with hopefully 2 speakers, because I believe we're waiting for Lynn Goldman to join.
Robin, she will be joining, but in a couple of moments. So
well, say it again, please.
My apologies, Rob. I just got a note from Lynn's schedule that she will be joining a few moments late.
I see. Well, in the meantime, how about those nationals?
No, she said to please proceed, and she will join.
The program for today is going to be Mustafa and Lynn on the subjects you've all seen previously. What the key intersection is that we're looking at today is COVID, environmental exposures, and the justice context in which this is all being experienced. And Mustafa has been the face and the voice of EJ in many ways at the agency. And 3 years ago, he decided that there was a better place, and he is now the vice president of the National Wildlife Federation, principally focusing on environmental justice. And he's bringing that voice to many different forums, and is going to offer his thoughts today on these justice implications of the intersection of those factors. Lynn Goldman, Dr. Lynn Goldman is—
Jesus Christ.
Say it again, please.
Oh, no, just proceed, Rob.
Lynn is the Dean of the School of Public Health, the Milken Institute School of Public Health at George Washington University. She is, as I mentioned, a pediatrician by training, but degrees in science and public health. She was also the assistant administrator for pesticides and toxics at EPA in the 93 to 2001 period. So, pardon?
Thank Bonnie.
And by the way, I want to thank Bonnie Bello as well, because her leadership on the communication side has made so much of this possible. And I personally nominated her for sainthood, and I think that will be an interesting outcome. But we certainly want to note that. Now, if Lynn hasn't joined us yet, we can possibly go ahead, and Mustafa, if you could begin. We're taking 8 to 10 minutes for each of our speakers. I'm then asking that each speaker pose a question or an observation to the other, and that I'll insert a question. And then at that point, we're hopefully at about 1:30, we are going to switch to the Q&A format with Michelle taking over that portion of the program. So I think that we should go ahead and begin, Michelle, with Mustafa's comments. Just thinking everyone has gathered here, so many of them, and they probably don't want to hear unending reference to my silly subjects. So does that make sense to you, Michelle?
Thank you, Rob. Yes.
Great. Well, Mustafa, I wonder if you could jump in, and when Lynn joins us, I'll give her a kind of 10-second, background on what I've just said, and I think it can work well. So Mustafa, take it away, and we're looking forward to your wisdom and hopefully your encouragement to move forward.
Thank you, Rob. And thank you to everybody who's on the line watching and listening. I know many of you played a role in me growing up, and I learned a lot from many of you over the years when we were at the Environmental Protection Agency. Thank you also to EPN for having the forethought to begin to look at ways of evolving, of growing. You know, we were really blessed when we were inside the agency that politics really didn't play an incredible role in many of the decisions that were being made. We had folks who were Democrats and Republicans and independents who were focused on the science, who were focused on the law, who were focused on doing everything that we could to protect the lives of the citizens across our country. So I'm blessed to have been able to grow up and to experience that and to help it to frame out the way that I approach the development of policy and the engagement with frontline communities. I thought maybe the best way for me to also begin our conversation, of course, is honoring that this is Juneteenth and those freed slaves who actually had, you know, for 2 years, didn't have access to the information that would have allowed them to begin the journey toward justice inside of their lives. And I think somebody has their, yeah, there you go. So I'm going to start off with the testimony, some of the testimony that I shared on Capitol Hill just a couple of weeks ago, which started off with frontline communities are under attack. They're under attack from multiple emergencies happening at the same time. Black communities are dealing with the systemic racism that has infected the policing in our communities, that is literally choking us to death. The rolling back of environmental regulations has us gasping for air due to the cumulative public health impacts from the burning of fossil fuels. And of course, folks are dying and getting infected with COVID-19. And of course, if we're going to have an honest conversation about the need for us to strengthen our existing laws and statutes that are on the books, then we have to call out the fact that our most vulnerable communities, communities of color, lower wealth communities, and indigenous peoples have been disproportionately impacted since the founding of our country. And we have to begin to make sure that we are addressing that. The reality of the situation is that communities of color, frontline communities, our most vulnerable populations are the places where we put everything that no one else wants. We know that disproportionately our fossil fuel facilities are located in those communities. We know that our fossil fuel infrastructure, the pipelines, the 2.4 million miles of pipeline that we have in our country, that literally we could go to the moon and back, to the moon and back again, and on our way back to the moon. That's how much pipeline we have that is actually running through communities of color, it's running through indigenous land, it's running through farmland, it's running through low-income white land, and in many instances ending up on the Gulf Coast back in those communities of color. And we also know that over 100,000 people are dying prematurely each year in our country, the United States of America. They're dying prematurely from the exposures that come from air pollution. We know that that's more people who are dying from air pollution than are dying from gun violence. And we know how incredibly important it is to focus on gun violence issues. That's more people who are dying from air pollution than are dying from car crashes. And we regulate that and we work diligently to be able to put the protections in place that are necessary to continue to minimize and to shrink those numbers. So we should be as focused on making sure that we have the right types of effective legislation, the right types of statutes, our laws, making sure that they are actually helping to protect everyone inside of our country. But we know who is being disproportionately impacted. We know that we have 24 million folks in our country who are suffering from asthma. Everyone who's watching this knows someone, whether it is a grandchild or a child, a niece or a nephew, or other relatives who unfortunately are dealing with asthma. And we know that we've got 7 million kids in our country who are also dealing with this. And of course, there is a strong correlation between the air pollution and the asthma attacks. And unfortunately, the loss of life that happens also when you have asthma. And we know disproportionately that it is African-American and Latinx communities are who the ones who are going to the emergency room and the ones who are going to unfortunately lose their lives. With knowing that, we have to ask the question, why do we continue to weaken the various laws that we have in place, those actions that could help to protect those lives? But we also have to be honest about how we got here. And we know that systemic racism has played a role in where people end up. We know restrictive covenances, we know redlining has pushed people into certain communities. And once they're pushed into those communities, there was a disinvestment that happened over the years, a weakening of the infrastructure. And by weakening that infrastructure, therefore putting people's lives in danger. We know that in our country, we have 80 million people who are uninsured and underinsured. And we also know that disproportionately, folks of color fall into those numbers. We also know that we have these medically underserved areas that also we find are representative of many of the communities that we label as environmental justice communities. And we know that we've got 20 million people in our country who are living in physician deserts, meaning it's much more difficult for folks to be able to actually get to a doctor, to get a diagnosis. And we won't even get into the medical biases that have existed in some of the medical system by some of the doctors, of course, not all. And we also know that the other overlying factor is the fact that we have folks who are dealing with food insecurity, who are literally living in food deserts themselves. We got over 23 million people who fall into that category. And then we have folks that I often talk about. We talk about vulnerable communities, and then there's a set of folks who are even more vulnerable than the traditional set of folks that we talk about. And those are the folks who are homeless or who are housing insecure. We have over 500,000 people who fall into that category. And sometimes in our work, whether at the Environmental Protection Agency or a number of the other agencies and departments, those individuals seem to be missing. They seem to always fall through that safety net that many of us work so diligently to strengthen. So we've got to make sure that those individuals who in many instances are taking in more pollution than others in our society, that they're being given consideration. And of course, there was a spotlight that has been placed on that community when one of the lessons we learned about COVID-19, about how do we protect ourselves from the coronavirus, of course, is washing your hands. But if you don't have access to clean water, if you don't even have access to water, it makes it very difficult for that to take place. But we also know that many of our traditional environmental communities, environmental justice communities, have also been dealing with water insecurity because of the shutoffs that have been going on. And of course, there's been a moratorium. But once the moratorium is over, then folks now have these mounting bills that they will have to deal with. And of course, that goes back to some of the work that many of us have focused on over the years in making sure that the water infrastructure is in place, that the resources that are necessary to help people to be in a much safer place are in the hands of the folks who need them. And we know there are still gaps in that process. So we can have the Safe Drinking Water Act, we can have the Clean Water Act, but if we still have disparities that are happening, then we've got to go back to the drawing board. We've got to work with our elected officials and our frontline communities and the other organizations that have expertise to actually make sure that we are addressing that. And of course, in relationship to COVID-19, you all have seen the numerous studies that have come out that talk about the connection between air pollution and those chronic medical conditions that many communities face because of their exposures to air pollution over the years, the cancers, the kidney and liver diseases, the lung diseases, and a number of other things that are in that public health space that was a part of our mission. And of course, when you've had one of those chronic medical conditions, it makes you much more vulnerable to COVID-19. So the work continues, justice continues for us to be able to actually do this. The beauty of this moment is that even with all of these extreme conditions that are going on, these challenges that we find ourselves in, that there are men and women of good conscience who are coming together, that folks are coming out of their silos to address these issues, that people of all races and creeds are coming together and saying that the 21st century cannot look like the 20th century, that we are going to make sure that justice and equality is a part of everything that we do. And that is a moment that I think many of us have been working for and towards, and know that this is one of the ways that transformative change will actually happen. So I think that we're very blessed in this moment. And what I'm seeing is that organizations are looking at their boards, they're looking at their senior management and middle management and saying that, does this organization actually look like America? How do we know that our priorities are correct if we're not hearing from the folks that we say we want to protect, or the folks that we know need our assistance and help? They need us to stand in solidarity with them as true, authentic allies. I also see that when this administration, and I'm not going to get political, but we'll just call out the facts. When we see people who are trying to, manipulate and weaken the clean car rule, when we see folks who are doing things around the Clean Power Plan or removing us from the Paris Climate Accord, that we see folks on the local and the county and the state level. And we see some governors around our country who are saying that when the federal government won't do what its responsibility is, that we will enter into that space and we'll do what we can to shore up that gap. Now, that does not take away the responsibility that the federal government has, but it does say something about our country that people are willing to stand up and do the right thing. So with that being said, I'm just going to say that I'm proud to be a part of EPN. I'm proud of the work that I get to do at the National Wildlife Federation and the work that I did at the Hip Hop Caucus, and of course, the work that I did at EPA. But there is so much more work that still needs to be done. And we have to stand together in solidarity to make the change that's necessary. I haven't yet been blessed with children, so y'all pray for me, and I hope that one day that becomes a reality. But I do have nieces and nephews. I know you have children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and I know each and every one of us want to make sure that we are leaving a planet that is safe and healthy, and that we also want to make sure that all communities in our country are honored and respected, and that racism will no longer be a part of the design of policy or the actions that play out because of that. So thank you all so much for a couple of minutes of your time. And thank you also for all you've given me over the years, the information, the pats on the back, the pushes, and the redirections when you saw a young man maybe going to the left when he should have been going in a different direction. So thank you all so much.
For those thoughts. It's very energizing. Obviously, on the one hand, it's informing, but as we said earlier, it's being energized and motivated. June and I have a family, and our oldest son, just several days ago when we were speaking of this, said, "Dad, get over it's being a moment and make it a movement, and make it a movement that has a future." And I love the idea of, as I say, focusing on this moment, but making sure it's linked to this, that we demand of ourselves, that we change, that we create. And also thank you to June Taylor for giving all the leadership and guidance she had. Because Lynn hasn't been able to join, I believe the best, way to proceed here is to go straight to the Q&A portion of the program. And Mustafa, you can take as many of these as you want, and Michelle, take it away.
Sure, wonderful. Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Mustafa. We'll just go over some housekeeping again. So please mute your line. I will need to mute you if you don't mute yourself. If you're on the phone, to mute and unmute is *6. And on the app, I think most folks can see that. How we're going to deal with the Q&A is we're going to ask folks to raise their hands. So how you do that if you're on the phone is to press *9 And how you do that on the computer is to click on participants and click on raise hand. So we will open it up to questions now. Karen, I saw you raise your hand. I don't know if that was by accident, but I bet you have a good question.
Actually, I do have a question. Am I on mute or am I unmuted?
You're good.
I'm good. Okay. We talk about the regulations that have been rolled back, which we all know is over 100 at this point. At least, you know, a lot of them are being litigated. Assuming that the White House gets flipped in November, my question to Mustafa is, how long will it take to undo the damage that's been done, and what else needs to be done to move the whole discussion forward in terms of achieving environmental justice as opposed to where we are right now, which is environmental injustice? So that's my question.
Well, you know, I hope that whomever the new administration is realizes that environmental justice, the Environmental Protection Agency plays a role in that, but that there are 17 federal agencies and departments that have equal responsibility in that space, because we are talking about transportation issues, housing issues, we're talking public health issues, of course, we're talking about economic issues, we're talking about enforcement issues, and all of this coming together to actually be able to help communities move from surviving to thriving, if you will. So they have to also understand that we need to make sure that there is a full environmental justice analysis for all the major decisions that are going on. So I often, you know, talk with folks both on the Senate and the House side, and they say, Mustafa, what's that one thing that would be beneficial? Well, if you do that analysis, then we can make sure that we are shoring up some of these gaps that seem to continue to happen when we're moving forward. It also helps us to redirect resources to the communities that need them the most. And of course, we have to make sure that the voice of communities, that they are speaking for themselves, that there's transparency, and that it helps us to make sure that there's real anchoring and connection with what folks are asking for on the outside. And of course, lining that up with the science and the law that's necessary. And when we see that there are still shortcomings that exist, whether in the science or the law, then we need to also work in those spaces to help to strengthen that. And there, of course, are processes for us to do it, but that has to be prioritized. For me, I think that the agency also needs to take a stronger look at its enforcement work to make sure. So I really want to help business and industry to do the right thing. And there are those out there that do the right thing. But of course, we have those who continue to try and skirt the law, who continue to try and do some things that we know are not helpful. So I want those folks to also understand that there will be accountability for those types of actions. So for me, we can get things back on track. I'm very honest. I never tell anybody who to vote for. I say vote for somebody who cares about your communities and who cares about your future. So with that being said, you know, you've got to make sure that the first thing is having the right person who's in office, but you don't stop there. So all the work that we try and do at EPA and on the rest of the federal family is only directed, as all of us know, but far too many people outside of DC sometimes don't understand. If we don't have the governors, if we don't have the folks on the county commissions and on the local city councils who are also moving in the right direction, then it slows that progress. So for us to address the 100+ that have been rolled back, then that means that we need to be engaging in the civic process, and we need to be thinking critically about getting the right folks in, because then they will help to strengthen, you know, the structures and the laws that guide us, and they will also help to make sure that the resources make it so we can get the real work done.
Great. Thank you so much, Mustafa, and thank you, Karen, for that question. Jim Ketchum-Como, do you have a question?
Yes, thanks. I wanted to ask how well you thought the executive order on environmental justice issued during the Clinton administration has worked over time, and whether statutory changes are needed to be more effective environmental justice, and if so, what general direction?
So I think that the executive order 12898 that was signed by President Clinton in 1994 was what was needed in that moment. It was needed in that moment because we needed to begin to get these other federal agencies focused on this issue. Because to be quite honest, the majority of them have many more resources to be able to help to rebuild communities, to address some of the injustices that were happening in those communities. And we started off with a smaller number of folks, and now there are 17. I think that that needs to expand because we have a set of new challenges as well, especially with some of the impacts that are happening from climate, some of the new chemicals and other things that we are now finding are having some impacts. So there are some opportunities there, along with knowing that we need to move toward a clean economy and that there may need to be some of the additional agencies that have a stronger focus on job creation and financial stability playing a stronger role also in that space. I think that, you know, we do need a new environmental justice executive order or an expanded order. But I think we also need to build the infrastructure that will help that to better exist. And for me, that means that there needs to be a space in the White House. And CEQ has played a great role over the years, but I think that it's now time for us to have some other spaces and places that are also honoring this work and that are coming together to help to make change happen. I think that we also have to play a much more significant role in the cumulative impacts that are happening inside of communities. I think we need to take another look at our civil rights laws and how they can be strengthened, especially in the environmental context and with some of these other impacts that we see going on. So I think that in the next executive order, it will begin to take a look at the additional impacts that are happening from climate change. How do we strengthen some of the civil rights related possibilities that will exist in this space? I think it will also begin to take a look at technology and how do we better utilize the innovation that's happening in that space to also address some of the impacts, but also to move us forward and helping folks to have a new set of opportunities.
Thanks very much.
Great. Robin June, do you have a question? Wait, you're muted. Hold on.
Sorry. So I just have a point to make. In the Newsweek article, it also mentioned the 100 rules and regulations that have been rolled back. But in fact, they haven't been rolled back. The administration has not been successful because they haven't been careful and done things right, as we just learned with DACA in the Supreme Court this week. And one of our partners, Joe Goffman at Harvard, is tracking this. I think it's only about 97% of them have failed because they didn't follow the Administrative Procedures Act. I mean, sometimes you have to thank God for the bureaucracy. Anyway, so I just wanted to make that point, and I wondered if we should write a letter to Newsweek saying, you know, thank you for, you know, the discussion of the problem, but recognize that due to their lack of care and incompetence, they actually haven't been successful totally in doing what they wanted to do. That's my point. Thanks.
No, can you guys hear me? I can't tell. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. So no, I think you're correct. I mean, they have been ineffective in the sense that they thought that they could quickly be able to make some of these moves. And with that being said, we should not be lulled into a false sense of security that as these are making it through the courts, that they may not be successful on some of them. And for me, coming from the work that I do around vulnerable communities and understanding that what we've had in place has been the basics, the bare minimum, that many folks have said, we appreciate these, but we need something stronger. So for one win or two wins out of 98 or 100, there are devastating effects for those communities that are already dealing with the cumulative impacts. They're dealing with the toxic loading that's going on. And of course, inside of that 100, that's not all just the Environmental Protection Agency. There are a number of other things from other agencies and departments that are often a part of that list. So we just have to stay diligent in helping to educate people, highlight it. I think we should also highlight the fact, so that people have the fullness of the information that, many of these have not yet been successful, but that we need you to continue to put a spotlight on it. We need you to get engaged. We need you to utilize public comment periods when those are available. And we need you to raise your voice. And then we need you to think critically about all those elements and how it plays into your vote in November, up and down of the list of possibilities.
Great. Thank you, Mustafa. Bonnie Bello.
Yes, hi. So Mustafa, you talked about the executive order, and I was very glad to hear you talk about the need for it to be strengthened and expanded. If you were at EPA in 2021, or someone who will be in that position, how does the agency actually reach out and actually work with the communities we're talking about all over the country? Because that has been a challenge all along, not only because the executive order is somewhat limited in what it prescribes, but because of the way the agency has approached it. So, it's very overwhelming, but I would love to hear from you, what you would do. How does EPA better serve the communities directly?
I would put more resources into making sure that we're actually out in communities. I've seen how difficult it can be for communities to come to Washington, D.C., to come to regional offices. And yes, those are anchors, and we want to make sure that those types of opportunities are always there. But I would make sure that we were spending more time. I would make sure that whoever our administrators and RAs are, that a significant percentage of their time, and trust me, I understand all the priorities and pulls on your time, but I would have people spending more time actually out in communities. I would also structurally build additional opportunities for engagement with communities. And we have, over the years, we've gotten better, we've evolved, but there's still a number of things that need to happen. We have yet to tap into the incredible innovation and ingenuity of young people. I would make sure that there was a space and a place inside of a new 21st century EPA for full engagement with all of these young leaders that are out there across the country. I would also make sure that we, if they were interested, that we were hiring more people who have done work in or come from these frontline communities. And I would also increase opportunities beyond NEJAC, the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, to get full engagement with folks. We make sure that we don't violate any FACA laws, of course, but we need to be creating additional opportunities to be getting that input from folks. And then, of course, I would better utilize the interagency working group. I think it is one of our great tools that we just have not yet utilized to the full capacity. So I would make sure that was elevated to a higher level. And that we made sure that all of the leadership in those 17 departments and agencies and a couple of White House offices who are supposed to be fully engaged, we're focusing on making sure that this is integrated throughout the federal family in a very significant way. I'm not just talking about, folks going through a 3-hour or 6-hour training. We would make sure that we actually have real systemic sets of opportunities that are built into our process.
Yeah, this is Marva King. I just want to add to what Mustafa was saying. Hope you guys can hear me. I'm on the phone. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Marva. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. So just to add to what Mustafa was saying, we've done it before. I mean, we did it in the Clinton administration under the NEJAC. We had representations from work groups and subcommittees from every office in EPA. And that gave us a larger and deeper breadth of people that we could work with and give advice directly to that office. Directly to that office. And for the IWG, I would say that they also has work groups that can put community people on as, add them to their smaller work groups. I don't think they can do it on the larger, but at least to the smaller. We have to find a way, as Mustafa said, to dig deep into these communities because they need to have a voice. They know more than we do how to help them. Thank you for listening.
Can I add to that?
Sure.
Hey, this is Cynthia. You know, I think if you look back over time as well in terms of the amount of funding that has been given to communities, the EJ Small grants, the collaborative problem solving, even the contracts we used to have with the Office of Environmental Justice to actually get out and help communities, all of those resources have been cut significantly. So, I mean, one grant per region and things like that. It's just challenging for communities. And I think from what all I gather now, there's hardly any engagement with communities in EPA. Even in places where we should really be engaged, where we have Superfund sites and things like that we're doing a lot of work on. There's hardly any public meetings, there's hardly any fact sheets. If you start looking at how often community involvement plans and things like that are being updated, those things are not happening. The staff, when they try to get information out to the communities now, it is very difficult. When other organizations come to EPA and try to engage with EPA around community involvement activities, it's also very difficult. So, you know, it's almost like we have to start from scratch again. But I think we really do need to look at the funding that is going into the Office of Environmental Justice and making sure that it's getting down on the ground in communities.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cynthia. Mustafa, did you want to respond to that, or I can call on the next person?
We can go to the next one. I think Dr. King and Ms. Purifoy, they knocked it out the park.
Wonderful. Thank you. Carrie Clow.
Hi, thanks for calling on me. Hi, Mustafa. Great talk. Appreciate it. I just wanted to bring up, somebody brought up the Harvard study and the Newsweek article about the backing off on the rules and so forth that this administration is doing. The Save EPA alumni group just put together and put out a 27-page paper on that. And it is short paragraphs covering each of the items that this administration has been following up or trying to. It is correct, a lot of them they haven't accomplished, but there are quite a few they have. Two of the primary authors for that Save EPA article are on the call, Jim Ketchum-Colwell and Ellen Kurlansky. If they want to mention anything about it. What we are right now beefing up, and Ed Hanley's been in touch with you, Mustafa, about beefing up the portions on systematic racism. And we think there's a lot to cover, not just from the air side, but many, many other aspects that this administration is pushing hard, but have been systematic problems basically since the start of EPA. And so we're going to try to look at putting together a more thorough analysis of that. Back to you.
Thank you, Carrie. That was a wonderful report. And thank you to Ellen and Jim and Nancy for pulling that together and everybody's work to try to make it better. Before I call on Joe, I did want to just tell folks that might not have been on the call at the beginning to mute or unmute your line. Please press *6 if you're on the phone, and if you'd like to raise your hand but you're on the phone, please press *9. And Joe, please tell us your last name and ask your question.
Press Alt-A. I'm sorry.
Joe, I have unmuted you.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Last name is Teeger. Mustafa, you mentioned the need for analysis. I want to be sure that we all support, when we get a new administration, that we do not fall into analysis paralysis. Even going back to the old regulations will be or the existing unreversed regulations will be an improvement over what this administration is doing. But this administration has been using the executive order process to really weaken enforcement across the spectrum, the Endangered Species Act, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, as well as EPA's enforcement. And we have, in the past, not always used our enforcement authority to be what I call action forcing enforcement. And that is not only getting the cleanup at Superfund sites, which is where I spent my time, but in reaching out to ensure that the companies, many of whom paid the penalties under RCRA and even under Superfund cleanups, as just an ordinary part of doing business. We need to use enforcement more effectively. We also need, one of the things I found fascinating at EPA and doing Superfund enforcement was how many different areas of law it reached into. For example, one of the major impacts on, particularly since we lost the Superfund, the tax, bankruptcy code has terrifically impacted an awful lot of the Superfund sites because the companies escape their liabilities through bankruptcy, and environmental claims are not secured. So we would get pennies on the dollar competing with other people, such as retirements, for the limited resources that were left. So we need, in a new administration, we need to be considering and promoting a broad outreach for more resources, which of course will enable us to do things for the underserved and impacted communities. Very often, the program and the staff and everyone would say, we need to do X, and people and management would turn around and the budget people would turn around and say, yes, we need to do it, but we can't fund it. And so we didn't do relocations. We did not, and we have not used enforcement, for example, to require them to buy out and relocate communities, particularly in areas like Cancer Alley. So I think as we move forward, one of the first things that new administration needs to do is reverse damn near every administrative order that this administration has put in place that affects the environment. And then next, we need to get more resources into enforcement, which returns more dollars than we spend in terms of getting environmental effects across the board on every community and through every media. Thank you.
Okay.
I agree with everything that you said. And folks know, especially probably in the last 15 years of my career, I've been so incredibly focused on revitalizing vulnerable communities. I think that, here's the thing, for those of us, who worked at the agency, there was a lot of really good and incredible work that happened. And in many instances, nobody hardly ever knew about it. So it made it much more difficult for us to advocate for the resources that were necessary to show how change was really happening. And, I talked with senior management before I was, and they were like, well, that's not really what we're supposed to do. We're not supposed to be marketing. We're not supposed to be promoting those types of things. And I disagree. I agreed with them with a number of things, that we had to do, but I disagree with that. We have got to get the resources so that we can show how change can, has, and will happen. And Joe, thank you for sharing some of those ways that we can do that, and also where we can focus those resources.
Great. Thank you, Joe and Mustafa. Lynn Goldman has joined us. Lynn, we only have a couple moments left in the call, and I apologize that so many forces were working for your time today. I was wondering if you wanted to share a couple of thoughts and maybe a last question to the group before we wrap up.
So I'm just going to share, one thought, because it's toward the end, and I really am so happy, actually, that Dr. Ali was on, because we spoke before this, and I know his message is really needed right now. The pandemic itself, I think, has, one of the things that it has done is that, in places in our society where we have fissures and cracks and where things on a normal basis don't work well, it's turned those into enormous chasms where it's become obvious to people and what those issues are, and whether that is, the dysfunction of our healthcare and public health system, racism, and the way that race has played such a major role in the course of this pandemic, but also the environment, and the fact that we have had a we've lived in a context, I think, been far too tolerant of a context where science is not given its due in decision making by policymakers, and whether that has to do with, you know, the science around environmental health and the impacts of environmental exposures on health, or even, you know, the science around protecting ourselves from the coronavirus. And the fact that, I don't think it's any big coincidence that the same administration that has done nothing but roll back environmental protections has also promoted racial and social injustice and inequity, the support of some of the very worst forces in our society, and has, from the top level, not provided the leadership that we needed to have to fight the pandemic, even to provide the health care that people needed, that we've had to rely so much on the states and others to do that. And the amazing thing for me has been that, you know, these invisible people in public health, like me often, and all of you, have become visible, you know, as Mustafa said, you know, that we've been in the background, we haven't promoted ourselves, people haven't been aware of us. And that's not who we are. We've been servants, we've been wanting to prevent adverse things happen to the environment and to people. But, you know, the public knows that we exist now. And this is a good time to come forward, you know, that our work is important, support us, but also to listen and to the science, to you know, as hard as it is to confront. You know, if I told people a year ago that a bat being captured in the wild and brought into a live animal market and exposed to a bunch of other animals like pangolins would lead to a global pandemic that would shut down the economy of the entire world, they would have thought I was crazy. And I think there are people who have thought, when we talk about climate and other environmental risks, that we're crazy as well. And I think it, you know, this, I think, brings to people the reality that they just have to listen. And so I thank you for giving me a chance at the end, Michelle, to say a couple of words. And I apologize, you know, for having been called away, but I will say how important it is to me to support this organization. I really think that it's fighting well above its weight class, and that the fact that this is a bipartisan group that is all about the environment, and it's not about this or that political candidate, or it doesn't have an axe to grind about its personal interest. I think it has tremendous amount of credibility, and I thank all of you who volunteer so much time for it and making that happen.
Thank you so much, Lynn and Mustafa. And as Lynn mentioned, about all of you operating our organization, EPN, all of you as the volunteers that do all the substantive work of our organization. You are operating well above your weight class. You're doing incredible, incredible work. And we're very, very grateful to your support, for your support, both financially, many of you, as well as your incredible volunteer hours. I don't mean to embarrass Penny, Fenner, Chris, but I often tell people how, well, I have volunteers that spend the weekend reading studies and reporting back. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that you guys do in your spare time, while also caring for elderly parents and grandkids, and oftentimes working and having your own consulting practices. It's really incredible. And I do also agree with Lynn that the bipartisan nature is what makes this organization particularly valuable and meaningful. It is now 2 o'clock, and so I'm just going to thank again Dr. Goldman and Dr. Ali for being on this call and leading us in this great discussion, and to all of you. We will formally end this, but we will open things up if people want to continue the conversation. So thank you all for joining today. And Karen has her hand up to make a comment or question, but if others do as well, again, *9 or raise your hand. Thank you guys very much, and thank you, Rob, for your leadership at EPN.
You're very welcome. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Karen.
Karen.
I don't even need to do what I was going to do because Lynn did it. I wanted there to be a discussion about science, which seems to be a foreign object to this administration and unfortunately to too many other very high level people in our government around the country. So I'm good. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. All right.
Well, thank you everyone for joining our discussion, and it's an ongoing conversation, and we appreciate, Lynn, I know you are at a budget meeting that you simply had to deal with, and I want people to understand that she basically had no choice in this, that it was a last minute thing. Mustafa, you're wonderful. Thank you so much for giving the leadership and the energy that you do. And there will flow benefits, you know, from this entire endeavor. They'll be difficult to discern sometimes in the moment, but I think that there's movement in the right direction that's so substantial right now that I have a lot of hope and a lot of optimism about where we're going and where we can go. So thank you to everyone in EPN for doing all that you do.